Welcome back, everybody. It is Zafir Velji, and this is, I guess, my long-awaited return to long-form video. I've been preoccupied with some other things going on with other YouTube projects, as well as my own personal adventures in music and whatnot, but I am back, and I'm going to be doing some more stripped-down but long-form videos on topics that I believe are essential. These are going to be, intro-level discussions about various policy and geopolitical contexts, specific, again, to international relations, political science, so on and so forth. But again, I'm going to do like an introductory level kind of discussion in a lot of these conversations. Now, you're probably wondering, who am I? I am a political science student, well, graduated, so I have a degree in political science. I specialized in global development in the global south. So coming to this topic, I know a thing or two about the subject matter. And now I'm not an expert. I don't have a PhD or a master's degree in sub-Saharan Africa and the situation in there. I have at least a good level of insight to kind of instruct and talk about this on an introductory basis. So, for example, I am born in Mozambique. I grew up in South Africa, and my parents are also born and raised in Africa. So I have the personal experience of knowing what it is to be African, living in Africa. And I also have the experience of living in North America for quite a long time, over a decade now. So I can actually speak to the subject matter from a personal experience, from an educated background as well, and kind of give you some insights. I believe that Americans have the largest misconception in 5 key factors. 1, the thought and ideologies of African people. 2, the actual size of Africa and how large or how small it is. 3, what the population of Africa is, like in several different contexts. I guess more broadly, the demographics of it. So I'm going to address that as well. 4, the geostrategic and geopolitical game that African countries are engaged in on the global stage in an anarchic system, the international system, right now. And 4, what is the future of Africa? So the first one I'm going to address that I think Americans really misunderstand is that Africans and African people are monolithic, and that we all think roughly the same or have the same background, experience, culture. And this is just clearly just untrue. And in the second aspect, I'll explain in detail why this aspect makes kind of no sense when you really think about it. So Africans are not monolithic in thought, in values, in ideology, in religion, in culture, in history, language, ethnic groups. It's just completely different. Like, there are over 52 countries right now in Africa that are recognized internationally. That's 52 different stories, 52 different backgrounds. And within those nations, there are regional differences, ethnic differences, linguistic differences, cultural, historical differences within nations, right? Take for example, South Africa. South Africa, the Rainbow Nation, is a vast, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilinguistic society. There's over 11 different national languages. Zulu, Xhosa, Sotho, Northern Sotho, English, Afrikaans. It's to sum it up as everyone having the same thing is just unbelievably naive. And I can speak, like, I was born and raised in Southern Africa. I know only Southern Africa. When I meet West African people, Ghanaians, Nigerians, their experience, their culture, their history, it is similar in some aspects, but very different in many other aspects. We're not the same. It's almost comparing like a Han Chinese person from Shanghai to a ethnic Japanese person in Yokohama. Sure, they might look similar to the untrained eye, but completely different backgrounds. You wouldn't even come close to saying that they're the same. So that is something people need to understand, is that African people are not similar at all. And going into the next aspect we'll talk about in demographics, but I just want to lightly touch on it. There's 1.5 billion African people. And amongst those are a variety of different ethnic groups, language groups, cultural groups, split all across the continent. The continent is the second biggest continent on the planet. And on top of that, it is the birthplace and cradle of human society. About 4 million years ago, Homo sapiens came out of Africa, specifically in East Africa. But what is clear is that they're not monolithic at all. There's a variety of thought, and leads why into another thing that's common amongst North Americans, even Canadians, is this preconception that Africa, sub-Saharan Africa in particular, is violent. There's always violence, and there's always some kind of war going on. Now again, there's 52 nations. A lot of these nations were drawn up on lines that don't make any sense whatsoever. And when you take into context histories, backgrounds, ethnic groups, you have rivalrous ethnic groups in one country that if it naturally, the nation state building process happened without the intervention of European colonial powers, probably would be drawn very differently to exclude or include certain groups, right? The nation building history of Africa is almost absent anything else in the world except maybe parts of Asia and Latin America. Certainly not the way North America or Europe was founded in terms of the nation building aspects to it. So you have people who are rivals, ethnic rivals, religious rivals in the same nation. And because they don't share the same thoughts and values, they go to war with each other for these thoughts and values. And they're willing to kill each other to have their values, thoughts, and considerations prevail over others. We are currently seeing this right now in Sudan, unfortunately, between RSF and Sudanese army forces. We've seen this historically all across Africa. One that's never really on the radar for people, but this is a very interesting conflict, very low skill intensity, but a very serious conflict, is what is happening in Cameroon. Cameroon is a Central West African nation that was a French colony, but has an Anglophone community near the border of Nigeria. And there has been skirmishes and fighting in Cameroon between the Francophone and the Anglophone communities in Cameroon, because the Anglophone communities kind of want to have more autonomy, more freedom and independence from the centralized government in Cameroon. So there's been a low intensity conflict for decades there that frankly nobody knows or talks about. Another interesting one is what happens in DRC. DRC is kind of the melting pot of Africa. Due to historical reasons that I can't get into in this video, that's a whole video in and of itself. The colonial history of Congo, and I'm talking about Democratic Republic of Congo, Zaire, Free State Congo. Now in Congo, there's been two major wars there, known as the Great African Wars, and it has brought multiple nations to bear, and it's probably the deadliest war ever in African history. Now, the causes for that war are multifaceted and have to do a lot with the Rwandan genocide and also the collapse of Zaire and also the collapse of the Belgian Congo colonial experiment in the 1960s for independence under Patrice Lumumba, and then him being assassinated, and it just categorically falling down from there. So, needless to say, it's not a monolith. It's very complicated. There's a lot of nuance and a lot of detail to almost every single country within Africa, and there's 52 of them. So just as much as there's nuance and details about Americans, it's hard to even say that America is monolithic, and it's one nation and has one major language and one general history of it being a former British colony. It's almost impossible to say that they're monolithic in thought. It would be ridiculous to make that kind of statement, because we know just geographically somebody from Northern California to Southern California are quite different, NorCal, SoCal. There's a reason why there's that divide. Now, Mozambique, my home country, is twice the size of California. And so to expect that every Mozambican would have the same kind of thought and theories and understanding would be just unfair. And so the main idea here is Africans are not monolithic. Now, this brings me on to my next point, geography. Africa is the second largest continent on the planet. And I think there's this misconception of how big it really is because of the Mercator projections on maps. Now, the Mercator projection is trying to project a 3D image, which is our planet, onto a 2D space, which is a flat map. And because no projection is perfect, it distorts what the sizes really look like. It looks like Greenland, for example, is this gigantic island that looks about the same size as Africa, but it really is not even close. Madagascar, which is the largest island in Africa, is quite large and comparable in size to Greenland itself, and it's just an island in Africa. It's right across from Mozambique. So that just gives you a context of how large it is. And I'm actually going to put an image here of America, the United States, a very, very large country fitting in Africa, and other countries fitting in Africa. It is massive. The size of even just sub-Saharan Africa is insanely large. And so, because of the geographical distances, it is only natural that people are very different, right? People in West Africa, just genetically, historically, ethnically, are going to be completely different from people in Southern Africa, just by how large the continent is. And so I don't think people realize just how massive it is. Some of the largest countries in the world are from Africa: Algeria, Sudan. Even after the splitting of South Sudan from Sudan, the nation, the Sudan Arab Republic, it is still one of the largest countries on earth. The Democratic Republic of Congo is absolutely massive. I believe the entirety of France could fit in the geographic space of South Africa. But when you look on a map, it doesn't seem like it would. But these countries are huge. Mali is huge, right? Algeria, Libya, and so on and so forth. Right now, I'm just going to put up a distance calculator so you can actually see. So this is Los Angeles in New York. And this is Accra, which is the capital of Ghana, and Addis Ababa, which is the capital of Ethiopia. These aren't even two opposite sides of Africa, and it's larger than the two opposite ends of continental United States. That just shows how massive Africa really is. And it also goes to show another thing. You know, when you see in the news something going on in Africa, there's a war or conflict or something, I think people, Americans in general, tend to assume like all of Africa is like violent, or all of Africa is having this issue. And that's just not true. Because of how large Africa is, something that's going on in like northern Nigeria is completely detached from the reality of someone in Angola or Tanzania. Like historically, in general, Southern Africa, since the end of the Cold War, is one of the most peaceful regions in the world. There really isn't that much violence, with the exception of South Africa, which has been going through a bit of a crisis over I'd say the last 5 years. It's been descending under. I'm not going to get into it, but South Africa, with being the exception here, being quite violent, and it's mostly domestic criminal violence. Southern Africa is incredibly peaceful. There isn't a lot of criminality or crime. There isn't war going on. It's basically any international disputes have been kind of settled come the end of the Cold War. There's no disputes between nations, like in a conflict sense, in Southern Africa. And so it's very peaceful. And lots of people can go to Zambia, Mozambique, Botswana, Namibia, and have a totally peaceful, calm time. Mauritius, Seychelles, Comoros are some of the most touristic and beautiful places in the world. Madagascar is an incredibly peaceful place too, although it's had a slight political issues, but a relatively peaceful place, beautiful country. So something that may be going on in Mali, for example, is completely detached from the reality of something that's going on in, Tanzania or Rwanda. So I feel like people don't understand how large of a space it is, that things aren't necessarily attached at the hip with each other. So, it would, like, for example, an American example is some crime going on in Baltimore has frankly nothing to do with Fargo, North Dakota. And it would be weird to assume that, right? So it's the same kind of scenario in Africa. It is so massive and large that really something that's going on in Sudan really has no effect on you if you're in Botswana. So that's the second part of this. Now we get on to the demographics. And this is, I think, the thing that people really just don't get or understand is Africa is the fastest growing population on the planet. African people are a huge part of the global population, 1.5 billion people. And it is only getting larger, and it will only get larger in the medium to long term future. It has the highest birth rate on the planet, bar none. And it's not even close. Africa is growing, it is growing fast, and it is very young. I'm going to show you a population pyramid right now. And I'm going to give you the context of an American population pyramid and a population pyramid of Italy and of France. So you can see it is not even close in terms of demographic dynamics to the Western world. And it's kind of odd. You're probably wondering what's going on here. Why is it like this? You know, Africa, because it has been underdeveloped for decades and even centuries, Africa has the highest infant mortality rate in the world. It also has the highest amount of people living on subsistence farming. So that's the kind of farming where you live off the land and you don't really make more than that. You're not trying to make money off of the crops you create. So there's an incentive amongst family structures to have as many kids as possible because the chances or the opportunities of one kid or two kids surviving till adulthood is not as good as it would be in the West, right? Again, Africa has the highest levels of infant mortality. It has the highest abortion rates as well in the world. So you are almost promoted, and there's a variety of cultural and religious incentives to have as many kids as possible to ensure that you have some generation of kids that will become adults and succeed you in the succession and become economically viable participants in their adulthood, as well as the fact that there is very limited to no social welfare programs in most African states because they're just frankly too poor to have it. So you are dependent on your children to basically provide for you until death because at a certain age, let's say 65, just to be more accurate to Western standards, if you are unable to work at age 65, but you're still alive and you die at 78, that's still a period of time of about 12, 13 years where you're a dependent on somebody else, maybe your spouse or your children, to take care of you until you pass away. Now, because there is no social welfare program, it is all on the kids, and there is no government state that will basically take care of you in your old age retirement. And so old age poverty is a massive issue in Africa, and as well as youth poverty and youth unemployment, because half of African population is under the age of 18. I'm 27 years old. You know, by most standards, I'm a young gun still. But in the African context, I'm on the other half of the population scale. You know, I'm a bit of an older person. And so, as much as it hates me to say this cliche, because this cliche is so overdone, and we'll go on to this in the last section of the video, the future is Africa. Half the population of Africa is under 18 years old. That is an insane proposition. So the future is Africa. The future of Western communities are Africans. These Africans are going to be our future economic participants because we are not, frankly, producing enough young children in the West. So we're going to have to replace them by young, capable, educated Africans coming from Africa to work in the West. So that is something we need to look at. We need to understand as Americans, as Westerners, is that Africa is the future. It is at least the future population until we come up with a remedy for the lack of population growth in the developed world. Now, the next point, and now we're going to talk about Africa's geostrategic position in the world today. Where Africa lies in the geopolitical, geostrategic sphere in an anarchic system that we live in, such as today, where there's nothing higher in terms of authority than the nations themselves as the sovereigns. How are African nations interacting with the world? I think to even analyze that or give it an analysis, we need to look at what has come before this moment. Africa faced 2 to 3 centuries of colonialism and also faced the Cold War. Colonialism is something Africans did not like, did not want. The Cold War and being proxy powers to the great powers such as the Soviet Union and the United States and Western powers was not appreciated either by African states and African people themselves. For in a personal example, my mother and my father's generation are now the people leading, like that age group is leading the nations of Africa right now, and they remember the Cold War. They grew up during the Cold War. They grew up knowing that they were pawns in a game on a global scale. And they also remember their colonial heritage. My parents were born in colonial British East Africa and colonial Portuguese Mozambique. My parents, not my great-grandparents, not my great-great-grandparents, my parents grew up there. I'm the first generation that has lived in a non-colonized African country. And so there's vivid memories of these experiences and how Africans were used. And so coming into this new generation where my age of people and younger are going to be in power, knowing what we know from the past historically, knowing what we know can happen to us, the outcome is going to be a lot different to what is happening. Because as you can see, we're heading towards a multipolar world where China, United States, the European Union, Russia are playing an integral role in disassembling the globalized world we thought to come after 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed and Francis Fukuyama declared, the end of history. Clearly it has not been the end of history, and we're heading towards a new multipolar world and a new, perhaps, Cold War. We don't know just yet. We are literally in the beginning decade of this new world. And Africans know that. And Africans know how strategic their countries, their populations, their economies, their resources are going to be to this global battle between the West and China and Russia. Now, with that said, what does that imply? It implies that Africans are going to be a lot wiser, a lot more skeptical, and a lot less willing to throw themselves into the fire in the name of a global hegemon. And that also means that they are going to be very particular and they're not going to be played by either side. In fact, they're probably going to play both sides to their advantage because they realize for far too long, they were pawns in another person's game. So now most African states are going to be wiser to approaches from, the IMF, the World Bank, the European Union, the United States, China, and Russia. With that said, Africa is the youngest population in the world. It is fastly growing. It is highly economically motivated in certain regions and certain cities. It is moving dramatically. And in other places, it's like an economic sideshow. Like some places, it's just complete stagnation. If you go to rural areas in certain countries, there's no development whatsoever. But in a lot of places, it's rapidly developing. The economies are growing at a tremendous pace. People are getting much more educated. The literacy rates in Africa are growing tremendously. So that means their future is the future of the world, and global powers will need to have them on their side. Right now, India is slowly becoming its own global superpower, and we're seeing the West, Russia, China, all trying to use them in their own way to their advantage in the near-term future because they're going to be a global power. And India, wisely enough, their foreign policy is to use everybody where they can conveniently, have a strategic non-alignment until absolutely necessary. And this is a step that most African states will take. Yes, there'll be quite a few African states will be committed to a specific cause or a specific global power. We're seeing Mali getting very closely aligned with Russia, Sudan, the same thing. But in general, roughly, they're going to play each side to their strategic advantage. And when you have some of the world's largest reserves of lithium, cobalt, tantalite, natural gas, Mozambique has the fourth largest reserve of natural gas on Earth. Large strategic reserves of oil. Oil will still be an impactful resource well into the mid-21st century, as well as other natural resources, cash crops, and other crops. It's going to become one of the bread baskets of the world, Africa. The agricultural sector is still the largest sector in Africa in terms of economic categories, but there's still tremendous room for growth in that category. There's still much more room for efficiency and quantitative growth in agriculture, which means Africa will be the breadbasket of the world. And that is going to be essential coming in to the mid and end of the 21st century. Now, what does the future hold for Africa, finally? It's hard to predict, least of all know what is going to happen in the future, but we can be certain for a few things. It is going to be the future of the world because it is going to be the most powerful body economically getting in to the end of the 21st century. It will have the largest force of young people working. It is the fastest growing population in the world. Economically, it is growing at a rapid pace in many countries and many cities all across Africa. Also, it is going to have high levels of literacy and education. Africans are not going to be taken advantage of for their resources. They're going to use their resources to leverage on the global stage their positions. And it's been clearly seen in the Ukraine-Russia situation, as well as what's going on in the Middle East already. We're seeing African powers leverage their resources, their political weight to their advantage when necessary. And they're not going to be pawns in a future multipolar conflict that we might be heading into throughout this century. So we can expect these things at a minimum. Will Africa as a continent come out as a superpower by the end of the century? It is hard to know, but there's a good expectation that it can be something special. And that is the end of this video. It was just an introduction level of looking into Africa. I really hope you appreciate it. If you enjoyed it, please comment below that you enjoyed it. Maybe there's something you'd like me to talk about. Please subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications. I'm going to try upload much more often on this channel. Please like the video, share it, and if you haven't seen my previous video on Qatar, I think you should definitely check that out. I put a lot of work into that video, and the end topic was a really interesting one, and it is about Africa, and I feel like I should just tease out with that outro because eventually I will get to that video, and I feel like it's appropriate for this one. And right now, we are witnessing a great race for these spheres of influence.
And bring Africa and the United States even closer than ever.
Безвозмездно предоставить Буркина-Фасо, Зимбабве, Мали, Сомали.
China will always be a good friend, a good partner, and a good brother of Africa. No one can destroy the great unity of the Chinese and African.